My wife became the top salesperson at her father's company. At a family dinner, she raised her glass and smirked. How does it feel to watch me succeed while you do nothing? The whole table laughed. Then she leaned back and added, don't be mad. I'm just teasing. I smiled. Teasing is fun, I said. Want to hear mine? She grinned until I stood up and said, I own 77% of the company. You're fired. The private dining room at that restaurant holds about 14 comfortably and 18 if you push it. Her father had booked it for 11, which meant there was space, which meant it felt intentional. The kind of gathering where the absence of crowding signals that the people present were chosen rather than accumulated. I had been in rooms like that one many times, not that restaurant specifically, but that room, the version of it that exists in every establishment her father preferred. Round-cornered, low-lit oil paintings in the vaguely maritime genre, the kind of chairs upholstered in leather that has been broken in just enough to feel expensive rather than new. A server who refills your water glass without being asked and disappears between courses as if there is a door behind them that only the staff can see. Her father sat at the head of the table. He always sat at the head. It wasn't a negotiated thing or a gesture anyone consciously made. It was simply how space organized itself around him. Her brother sat to his left, as he always did, a default position so established by that point that his chair might as well have had a small plaque on it. Her two cousins across from us. An aunt at the far end, who functioned socially as a kind of warm agreement. She spoke mostly in affirmation of whatever the last person had said, which meant she said very little in rooms dominated by her brother-in-law, since what he said required acknowledgement rather than response. My wife and I sat toward the middle. She had selected those seats herself. I had watched her assess the table the moment we walked in. A quick calculation that took maybe 2 seconds. The kind of effortless spatial read a contractor makes when glancing at a room to understand which wall is structural. She liked to be close enough to the center of things to matter, and far enough from her father that she maintained her own sphere of gravity. Too close and you became an extension of him. Too far and you became an afterthought. The middle was where the leverage lived. She had learned that about him over a long time, longer than I had known either of them. I had been to 11 of these dinners before that night. That one made 12. The format of those dinners never changed in any meaningful way. Her father would open with the quarter, revenue, closed deals, pipeline, competitive positioning, delivered not as a briefing, but as something closer to a testimony. He had a particular gift for making financial results sound like things you should feel moved to have witnessed. He would stand slightly taller than the room required, hold his wine glass at a height that suggested confidence rather than thirst, and speak with the cadence of someone who had been told many times over a long life that what he was saying was important. The quarter was always good, or good enough that the framing made it sound good. If revenue was up, he said so plainly. If it was flat, he identified the external conditions responsible and positioned the flatness as a kind of discipline. The company had not chased bad growth. If there was a loss somewhere, it had been a strategic one. He was skilled at this. I'll give him that. The man knew how to make a narrative out of a spreadsheet. After the numbers came the round of crediting. Her brother would note something her father had foreseen 6 months prior that had played out as predicted. Her cousins would agree. Her father would absorb this with practiced humility. A small wave of the hand, a brief smile of the whole team, really, while making absolutely clear through posture and follow-up that the team had succeeded because of the direction he had set. Then, eventually, the spotlight would find my wife. This had been true for the past 3 years, since her numbers had crossed a threshold that made her impossible to position as anything other than exceptional. She had closed more new business in her second year than anyone in the company's history. Her father would announce this with a particular brand of pride that managed to be both genuine and self-congratulatory, as if her success were partly his doing, which in the way that all parents feel this way, it partly was. She accepted the praise well. She never overplayed it, never deflected it to the point of seeming false. She would smile in a way that acknowledged the numbers without dramatizing them, and say something like, the clients have been generous, or this was a strong year for the market, which gave her father room to then say, no, this was you, which he always did, and which she had learned to expect. I would be asked about my work at some point during the dinner. The question always came from her brother, who was the most genuinely polite person in that family, and the one most committed to making the evening feel inclusive. He would ask how things were going, whether I was busy, whether I had any interesting projects. I would say things were good, that I was busy. That I had a kitchen renovation upstate I was finishing, or a set of built-ins for a brownstone in the city, or a library room for a client in Connecticut who had very particular ideas about what walnut should look like and was willing to pay to find out. Her brother would nod with what seemed like real interest. Her father would listen with the expression of someone waiting for the conversation to find its way back to something relevant. I had stopped being bothered by this around year 4 or 5. I'm not entirely sure when it stopped landing. At some point, it simply didn't anymore. We met at a birthday party in the fall. She was standing near the kitchen in a dark green dress, talking to someone I didn't recognize, and I noticed her before I knew whose party it was or whether I was even supposed to be there. A friend of mine had brought me along as a kind of ballast. He was going through something difficult that year and didn't want to be alone in social situations, which I understood and which I didn't mind. I was not particularly interested in birthday parties as a general rule. She caught me looking. I didn't look away. She held the eye contact for a beat longer than politeness required, then turned back to her conversation, and I took that as an invitation to find a drink. We ended up near each other at the drinks table about 20 minutes later. She asked me if I knew the host well. I said not particularly, that I was there with a friend. She said she was there with the same kind of friend, someone who needed company rather than solitude that night. We stood there for a moment, recognizing the symmetry of that. Then she asked me what I did. I told her. Custom cabinetry, finish carpentry, residential work. I gave her the short version, because I had learned that most people at parties wanted the short version, something to categorize you with before moving on. She didn't move on. She asked me what the hardest part of that kind of work was. Not the most interesting, not the most unusual, not the highest paying project. What was the hardest? I had not been asked that question before by someone who wasn't already in the trade. I thought about it for a moment and told her the truth. Reading a client's actual preference as opposed to their stated preference. That people often describe what they want in language borrowed from things they've seen in magazines or on television, and the gap between that image and what would actually make them happy in their own home is often significant, and the work is in closing that gap without them realizing you've done it. She looked at me the way people do when something they didn't expect turns out to be more interesting than they'd prepared for. Then she told me what she did. Sales at her father's company, a mid-sized firm in a technical service industry. She said it plainly, without the inflation that salespeople sometimes add to their job descriptions. She said she was good at it and that she liked the money and that she found the work genuinely interesting most of the time, which was more than most people could say. We talked for close to 2 hours at that party. I barely saw my friend. I called her 2 days later. She answered on the third ring, which I later learned was characteristic. She didn't ignore calls, but she didn't leap at them either. We had dinner the following week and talked until the restaurant closed and the staff were politely stacking chairs around us. We walked for another hour after that. I don't remember exactly what we talked about, only that it didn't slow down. We got married 14 months after we met. We were 28 and 31 at the time. She was the 31. I had always found that detail quietly amusing in retrospect. The early years of our marriage were good in the way that the early years of most marriages are good, which is to say they were also hard, and the hard parts were what made the good parts legible. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had good bones and bad plumbing. We ate dinner at the kitchen table most nights and talked about our days. She told me about her clients, the ones who were easy, the ones who required management, the ones who tested her in ways she found genuinely interesting. I told her about my projects. She was a good listener then. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered things. We had different ideas about weekends. She wanted to be out. Dinner parties, events, visits to her family, gatherings with a wide circle of colleagues and acquaintances she moved through easily. I wanted, more often than not, to be in. Not from antisocial feeling, but from something more like preference. I was around people all week in the way that client-facing work makes you around people. By Saturday, I was ready for quiet. She found quiet difficult. We negotiated this and mostly found our way through it. Her father, in those first years, treated me with what I would describe as cautious neutrality. He didn't dislike me. I don't think I gave him enough to dislike. He was uncertain what to do with me, which is different. He was a man who assessed people quickly and placed them in categories that served as a kind of operating software. This one is useful, this one is ornamental, this one is a threat, this one is irrelevant. I think I resisted categorization in a way that mildly annoyed him. I wasn't obviously ambitious, but I wasn't obviously content either. I was just doing my work, which he understood in theory and couldn't relate to in practice, since his work had always been about scale, acquiring clients, building teams, expanding reach, and mine was about something closer to precision. One cabinet, one room, one client who needed to be understood. He was not unkind to me in those years. He included me. He asked questions when social obligation required it. He was generous in the ways that come easily to wealthy people, picking up the check, offering introductions, making himself useful in material ways. What he didn't offer was respect in the register I think mattered, which was the kind that comes from actually seeing what someone does and understanding its worth. He never came close to that. I didn't require it from him, but I noticed. We were married for 3 years before my wife joined the company. In those 3 years, she had worked at 2 other firms, good jobs, decent money, respectable titles. She left the second one when her father offered her a position that she told me was too good to pass up. The compensation was real. The opportunity was real. She was clear-eyed about the fact that her last name opened the door, and she was equally clear-eyed that she intended to prove the door had been worth opening. I believed her. I still do. She was good at the job from the beginning. Not in the soft way that family hires are sometimes good, adequate, comfortable, protected from consequences, but genuinely, measurably good. She closed her first major account in her 3rd month, a contract worth more than her annual salary that her father's best rep had been chasing for 2 years. She didn't make a spectacle of it. She told me about it over dinner, matter-of-factly, the way you described something that confirmed what you already knew about yourself. Her father was proud. I could see it change his posture when the 3 of us were in the same room. Something in his shoulders dropped that had previously been held in a position of mild vigilance. She had removed a category of uncertainty for him. He no longer had to wonder whether bringing her in had been sentiment or strategy. It had been both, and both had worked. She settled into the company the way people settle into places they were partially made for. She understood the clients because she understood the specific kind of confidence and anxiety that ran through that industry, the need to to look like you were ahead of something, combined with the fear that you weren't. She sold to that gap. She was patient with difficult clients in the way that suggested she found them interesting rather than tolerable, which made them trust her faster than they would have trusted someone who was simply being professional. She also worked hard. I want to be precise about that. Whatever else is true, the hours were real. She was at the office before most of her colleagues and often home after dark. She took calls on weekends. She read industry reports on Sunday evenings the way other people watch television. The success was not accidental or purely structural. What changed over the following 2 years was something more gradual. Not the work itself, but the way the work began to reorganize the geometry of our life together. The dinners with her family became more frequent and more central. The professional and personal merged in ways that had always been true, but became increasingly absolute. Her colleagues became her social world. Her father's opinions became, incrementally, the ones that mattered most to her in questions of direction and value. I watched this happen. I didn't know yet whether it was a problem or just a change. It would take another year before I understood what I was watching. My work, in those years, was probably the most stable thing in my life. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest in a way I found reliable. A cabinet is either square or it isn't. A joint either holds or it fails. There is very little room for narrative in woodworking. You can't talk your way out of a bad cut. You either know what you're doing or the material tells you immediately that you don't. I had learned the trade from my uncle, who had learned it from a man he'd apprenticed under in his 20s, who had learned it from someone before that. It was the kind of knowledge that passed between people rather than through institutions, and I respected that about it. I was not formally credentialed. I did not have a portfolio website or a social media presence. I had a reputation built across nearly a decade of work that existed in the specific network of people who had hired me and talked about it afterward. The garage at our house was where I kept my tools and did my planning. I had converted half of it into a proper workshop, a good bench, a decent table saw, a router table I'd built myself, storage systems for hardware and finishing supplies. It was organized in the way that working spaces get organized over time, not for aesthetics, but for use, so that every tool was where your hand expected it to be and nothing required looking. I spent a lot of time in that garage, more as the years went on than she spent at home in the evenings. I didn't think of this as a retreat exactly. It was just where the work happened, and the work was what I thought about when there was nothing more pressing to think about. I would finish a client project and then spend an evening in the garage working through the joinery for the next one, or building something small for no particular reason, just to keep the hands moving. She understood this about me at first, or she seemed to. She had even found it attractive once, the specificity of it, the way I talked about wood as if it had intentions. Somewhere in the middle years that changed, the garage started to appear in her references to me with a slight shift in tone. Not cruel, not even consciously disparaging, just slightly distant, as if the thing I did there had moved from interesting to legible to simply where I went when I wasn't somewhere else. I noticed I didn't say anything. I had a specific role in my wife's social world, and I had come to understand it with some precision. I was not supposed to be interesting. I was supposed to be stable, reliable, present in the way that a wall is present, not the thing anyone looks at, but the thing everything else is arranged against. Her colleagues at the work events I attended were pleasant to me in the brisk way people are pleasant to someone whose name they need to know but whose company they do not require. A firm handshake, sustained eye contact, a question or two. Then, naturally, the orbit would pull them toward more useful conversations, and I would find my way to the drinks and the edge of things, which suited me fine. Her father's world was more particular. The people in it were accustomed to assessing one another, not casually, but as habit, what someone did, where they had gone to school, what their family name connected to, how their numbers looked. In that world, I did not score well by any of those metrics. I had no family name that anyone recognized. I had gone to a state university that nobody found interesting. My numbers, in the sense that the word implied revenue and scale, were modest by the standards of a room where revenue and scale were the primary vernacular. What I did have, though the room was not organized to notice it, was the holding company. But that came later. For several years, what I had was just my work, which didn't translate, and my presence, which was tolerated. Her father was polite to me at those events. He introduced me correctly and didn't wince at my jacket, which was the same jacket I wore everywhere, because I owned one good jacket and I saw no reason to own another. What he didn't do was look at me directly during any of the introductions. He looked at the people he was introducing me to. A small thing, the kind of small thing that stacks up over time. Her father never said anything openly unkind to me. I want to be precise about that because precision matters when you're describing something that operates mostly through implication. He was not the kind of person who made direct attacks. He was the kind of person who made architecture, the arrangement of words and glances and small conversational weights that, taken individually, meant nothing in particular, but which over time built a structure you could not help but live inside. The structure he built for me was this. I was a decent man who did not understand what the world required. He said this in the way he responded to anything I contributed during dinner conversation, a pause that was a beat too long before he pivoted to something else, a smile that suggested patience rather than engagement. Once, in the middle of a conversation about a material shortage I was navigating for a client, an honest professional problem with real implications, implications, he turned to his son and asked about the firm's supply chain exposure, as if I had said nothing, not dismissively, not cruelly, just with a completeness of redirection that made clear my contribution had not registered as worth responding to. He said it in the way he talked about my work to other people when I was present. He was always accurate. He would say I built custom furniture, which was close enough to true, or that I did renovation work, which was also close enough. But he said it with the flatness of someone listing an attribute that was neither good nor bad, like saying a person is 5 feet 10 inches. A fact, offered without context, without the framework that would tell you whether the fact mattered. He said it most clearly in the way he talked to my wife about her work, and his and the company's future. Those conversations happened in front of me without any attempt at inclusion, because I was not the audience for them and we all understood this. The company would grow this way. The company would enter this market next year. My wife would take on this responsibility in 18 months when she was ready, and they were already deciding together what ready would look like and what came after. I sat at their tables and ate their food and watched this planning unfold, and nobody thought to ask what I thought, because there was no universe in which my thoughts on the company's strategic direction were relevant. This was not unreasonable. It was their company. I had no stake in it for a while. The financial crisis at the company happened in the 3rd year of my wife's tenure there, and it was real in the way that financial crises at private family businesses are real. Quietly, without headlines, with a tight circle of people doing the math and a slightly wider circle of people sensing something was wrong but not being told what. I knew about it because she told me. She came home one evening in January with the particular tension she carried after bad days, not the constructive, forward-looking tension of a problem she was already solving, but something heavier, the kind that sits in your neck and doesn't let go. I asked. She told me. 2 of the company's 3 major institutional investors had decided to exit. One was rebalancing a portfolio, and the company simply didn't fit the new strategy. The other had concerns about growth projections that the company couldn't resolve before the investors' internal deadline. Neither departure was personal, neither was punitive, but together they created a liquidity gap that the company was not in a position to absorb without restructuring. Her father was selling shares to close the gap, quietly, through channels that didn't require public disclosure, to buyers who were willing to take on minority stakes without asking for board seats or operational input. He needed money fast, and he needed people who wouldn't make noise. The shares were priced to move. She said this with frustration. Frustration at the timing, at the investors, at the situation. She was not frustrated at the decision to sell. It was the only practical option, and she understood it. She was worried about what it meant for the company's trajectory, whether the restructuring would distract from growth, whether the clients would sense instability and begin asking questions. I listened. I asked reasonable questions. I expressed appropriate concern. What I did not say was that I had already made some calls of my own. I had a contact who had done work in private equity before shifting to something quieter. We had been friendly for years, the kind of friendship that survives on occasional dinners and genuine mutual respect rather than regular contact. When my wife first mentioned the investors pulling out, I had called him the next morning, not with any specific plan, but out of something more like instinct. He told me what the shares were likely worth. He told me what the process looked like for a buyer who wanted to avoid attention. He asked me how serious I was. I told him I was thinking about it. He said, "Think faster. These windows don't stay open." I set up the holding company on a Tuesday in February, in my attorney's office on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. I had worked with her on a contract dispute several years prior and trusted her to be both competent and quiet. Both qualities were necessary. The structure was simple. A limited liability company registered in Delaware, with me as sole member and managing owner, named for nothing in particular, a word I had chosen without significance, specifically because significance could become a thread to pull. The company would hold shares. That was its only function. It would not operate. It would not employ anyone. It would simply hold. My contact had identified the sellers and the price. The first block was a chunk of shares from one of the departing institutional investors. A clean transaction at a below-market price, fast and without ceremony. The investor wanted out before a certain quarterly deadline and had few options for buyers at short notice. I was not their first choice. I was their only choice that week. I signed the paperwork and transferred the funds. Sitting in the car afterward, I tried to identify what I was feeling and mostly came up blank. Not triumph. Not anxiety. Something closer to clarity. The kind you feel when a decision you've been circling finally gets made and you realize the circling was the hard part. I drove home. My wife was at the office. I made dinner, cleaned up, worked in the garage for an hour on a set of drawer joints for a client in the city. Then I went to bed. She came home around 9. She was tired, but not unpleasant. She told me about a call that had gone well, asked about my day. I told her I'd signed some investment paperwork, which was true and accurate, and she nodded in the way you nod at information that doesn't require a response. Then she said she was going to take a bath and read, and I said goodnight. I don't know exactly what I thought would happen next. I think I didn't have a plan, not yet. I had made the first purchase because the opportunity existed and the price was right, and some part of me had recognized that a window like this would not reappear. What came after? I hadn't fully decided. What I knew was that I was paying attention now in a way I hadn't been before, and and that the world looked different when you held a stake in it. By the end of that first year, I held 23% of the company. This had happened across 7 separate transactions, each structured to stay below the disclosure threshold, each routed through the holding company. My contact had identified willing sellers in the months after the initial institutional exits, smaller stakeholders, employees who had received share packages over the years and were ready to convert them, a former board member who had quietly moved on and needed liquidity to fund something else. Each sale happened at a price that reflected the company's actual condition rather than its promotional narrative, which meant the price was reasonable. I did not take any of this money from savings that my wife knew about. I had, over the preceding decade, made some investments independently, a small real estate stake in a partnership, some market positions, the kind of quiet accumulation that comes from living below your means for a long time when your means are sufficient. My wife knew I had money elsewhere. She had never asked for details, and I had never offered them because she had never seemed interested and I had never felt the need to explain. I handled my financial life the way I handled my work, competently, without drama, without requiring an audience. At 23%, I was a significant minority holder, not a controlling one. The company still belonged entirely to her father's world, his priorities, his decisions, his narrative. I attended the quarterly dinners and watched his performances and listened to his assessments of the market and said very little, which was what I had always done. Nothing had changed in that room. I had simply started to understand it differently. There was a particular satisfaction in that year that I found difficult to name. It was not the satisfaction of having done something to anyone. It was more like the satisfaction of a piece of joinery that comes out exactly as you planned, the pleasure of precision, of patience rewarded, of a thing that holds when you test it. I kept my own counsel about all of it. I didn't tell anyone, not my contact, who knew about the transactions but not the fuller picture, not my oldest friend, who I had known since before I was married and who would have had opinions, not my wife, who was at that point telling her colleague over lunch, I would learn this later, that her husband was, quote, sweet, but not particularly curious about the world. I was extremely curious about the world. I was simply quiet about it. The second year was different in texture from the first. In the first year, I had been reactive, moving when opportunities appeared, buying when the right seller surfaced, building a position without a fixed destination in mind. In the second year, I began to be more deliberate, not in an aggressive way, more in the way you become deliberate about a piece of joinery when you've been working on it long enough to understand exactly how it needs to go together. The picture clarifies. You stop improvising and start executing. My contact identified 3 more sellers over the course of that year. 2 were former employees who had left the company on good terms and retained shares as part of their departure packages. The third was a small institutional fund that had taken a position during the company's better years and was now quietly exiting an industry they had decided was not worth the attention. Each transaction was clean. Each was priced fairly. Each closed without drama. By September of that second year, I held 47%. I remember the specific moment I saw that number on the document from my attorney. I was in the car outside a client's house, waiting while the client's dog finished barking at something in the backyard before I could bring my tools inside. I had pulled up my email on my phone and opened the summary she had sent. The number was in the 3rd paragraph, stated plainly as a percentage of total outstanding shares. I read it twice, then put my phone in my pocket and waited for the dog to settle down. The company's management did not know. Her father did not know. My wife, who was by then closing deals that she described at dinner with the specific pride of someone who is genuinely excellent at something and knows it, did not know. The quarterly dinners continued. The dynamics continued. The small dismissals continued, accumulated, stacked. I kept going. By December, I was past 60%. The holding company now controlled a majority of the shares. In a formal governance sense, I had the ability to influence outcomes, board composition, major decisions, strategic direction. I did not exercise any of this. I was not visible. I had no board seat. I had made no contact with the company. I was simply the name on a document that sat in a filing system that nobody at that table thought to look at. I filed the relevant regulatory disclosures as required. They went into a database that was public in the technical sense and invisible in the practical sense, the kind of disclosure that complies with the law by existing without anyone finding it unless they already know where to look. Nobody looked. Her cousin's wedding happened in the spring of that second year, on a Saturday in April at a venue outside the city that had good bones and overdone flowers. It was the kind of wedding where the money was visible without being tasteful, which I had come to recognize as a signature of that family's social world, the assumption that spending announced quality, regardless of whether the spending had been directed at anything worth the announcement. I wore the same jacket I always wore. My wife had suggested twice in the preceding week that I might consider something else. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. The ceremony was brief and the dinner was long. Her father was in good form, relaxed in the way he was when the occasion was social rather than professional, which didn't happen often. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who is comfortable being watched and has been for a long time. He knew most of the guests. He was known by most of the guests. He was one of those people whose presence at an event functions as a form of endorsement, which he understood and used carefully. I sat at the assigned table with her brother and his girlfriend and 2 other couples I had met previously at other gatherings and whose names I could retrieve but whose company I didn't didn't particularly seek. It was a fine table. The conversation was inoffensive. My wine was good. Her father gave a toast midway through dinner. He was good at toasts. He had a feel for the form, the balance of sincerity and humor, the precise amount of personal warmth that reads as genuine to a room without becoming uncomfortable. He spoke about her cousin well. He told a story that was funny and made the young couple look good. The room applauded. Then he extended the toast, as he sometimes did at family gatherings, into something broader, about the family, about what it was built on, about the importance of backbone, his word used often, and of knowing the difference between people who would stand up under pressure and people who required support. He said this while looking, briefly but unmistakably, at me. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He moved on. Nobody reacted. My wife, across the table, looked at her wine glass. I raised my glass and drank. Afterward, at the bar, her brother found me and said something, a kind of apology-adjacent remark. Nothing explicit, just the generalized acknowledgement of a decent person who had witnessed something he couldn't fix. I told him not to worry about it. I meant it. By then, it was simply information, and I had more than enough of it. The phone call happened on a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks before the dinner. I had come home earlier than expected. A client had canceled a site visit at the last minute. A plumbing issue had opened up inside a wall that needed to be resolved before I could continue with the millwork, and the contractor needed 2 days minimum. I had no other appointments that afternoon, so I drove home, stopped at the hardware store for some consumables I'd been meaning to pick up, and pulled into the driveway around 3:30. She was on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't hear me come in through the side door. I set my bag down quietly, not deliberately, just the way I move at home, and was in the hallway before the words were audible enough to parse. She was talking to her sister. I knew by the rhythm, different from her colleague calls, more relaxed, less modulated. She talked to her sister the way people talk when they've stopped performing, which is to say, she talked the way she actually talked. He's sweet, she was saying. I'm not saying he's not sweet. A pause. Her sister's voice, too low to catch. I know. But there's a difference between being kind and being, I don't know, curious about anything. He does his thing in the garage. He takes his jobs. He comes to dinner and nods at Dad's speeches. He doesn't read the news with another pause. He doesn't know what ambition looks like. I don't mean that cruelly. He just doesn't have it. He never wanted to grow anything. I stood in the hallway. The afternoon light came through the window at the end of the hall in the particular way it does in October, horizontal and yellow. It's fine, she said. It's not a problem. He's a good man. I just mean, sometimes I think about what my life would look like if I'd married someone who was building something, she laughed quietly, as if catching herself. Never mind. It doesn't matter. He's not going to change, and I'm not going anywhere. I just needed to say it out loud. I stayed very still for a moment. Then I went back outside. I sat in the car for about 5 minutes. Then I came back in, through the front door this time, louder, announcing myself. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with a smile that seemed genuine, which it probably was. She kissed me hello. She told me dinner would be ready in about an hour. I said that was perfect. That night, after she was asleep, I called my attorney from the car. I told her I was ready to finalize everything. The paperwork took 3 days to finalize. It was not complicated in the mechanical sense. The documents had been prepared in advance, waiting for the instruction to proceed. What took time was the careful review. My attorney went through everything twice, which I had asked her to do, and which I would have insisted on regardless. The holding company's ownership position needed to be airtight. The regulatory disclosures needed to be filed in sequence. The employment contract that my wife had signed upon joining the company, a document I had obtained and read carefully several months prior, needed to be cross-referenced against the termination provisions that existed in Delaware corporate law. Everything was in order. On Thursday evening, I signed the final documents at her office. She handed me a copy in a plain folder and told me to keep it somewhere accessible. I put it in my car, in the bag I used for site visits, next to my measuring tape and a small notebook I used for client notes. Nothing about the bag or its contents would have suggested anything unusual to anyone looking at it. I drove home. My wife was working late, a genuine late I assumed, with a real client call scheduled for after hours. I made dinner for myself. I sat at the kitchen table and ate and looked out the window at the backyard. The leaves were mostly down by that point. The yard looked clean and bare and very still. I thought about the morning 3 years ago when I had made the first call. What had been clarifying about it? The feeling of doing something in the world that nobody could see, which was not so different from the way I felt about good woodwork. The hidden joinery, the parts of the structure that only worked because they were built correctly, that nobody would ever look at because they were inside the thing. I washed the dishes. I went to bed. She came home around 10. She smelled like the office and the cold air outside. She got into bed and said she was exhausted, and I said sleep, and she did. I lay awake for a while, not from anxiety, just thinking about the dinner, now 3 weeks away, and what I intended to bring. The folder sat in my bag for 3 weeks before the dinner. I did not take it out and review it. I did not rehearse what I would say. I did not construct scenarios in my head or plan for contingencies. I simply knew it was there, the way you know a tool is in its place before you need it. The 3 weeks passed normally. My wife worked. I worked. We had dinner together 4 or 5 times, talked about the week's logistics, watched television on the couch in the way that couples who have been married for years watch television. Not really together, but in comfortable proximity. She mentioned the upcoming family dinner once in passing, to say the restaurant had confirmed the private room room. I said that sounded good. On the evening of the dinner, she got ready in our bedroom while I sat in the kitchen and read. She came out wearing something dark and well-fitted that she had bought for a client presentation earlier that fall. She looked good. She knew she looked good. She asked if she should wear her hair up or down, and I sat up, and she nodded as if confirming something she had already decided. I wore my jacket, the same one. We drove to the restaurant together. She talked during the drive about a deal she was close to closing, a client who had been on the fence for 2 months and was showing signs of moving forward. She was energized by it, not in a manic way, but with the clean, forward energy she had when something she had worked hard at was about to deliver. I listened and said the right things and meant some of them. We parked and walked in. The maitre d' knew her father by name. We were led directly to the private room. Her father was already there. He rose when we entered, a gesture he made for her, not for me, and kissed her on both cheeks, the European affectation he had picked up somewhere in his 60s and never dropped. He shook my hand firmly. He looked at my jacket and didn't say anything. He was too polished for that. Her brother arrived minutes later. The cousins came in a group. The aunt took her usual seat at the far end. Within 20 minutes, the room was at capacity, and the first round of wine had been poured, and the rhythm of these evenings had started its familiar rotation. The compliments, the updates, the conversational deference to her father, who held the room with the ease of long practice. I set my bag down under my chair. The folder was inside. I had not mentioned it to anyone. Her father gave his summary of the quarter. Revenue was strong. The pipeline was well positioned. A competitor had stumbled in a way that reflected well on the direction he had chosen. He did not use the word I exactly, but it was present in every sentence. Then came her moment. She picked up her wine glass and looked around the table the way she did when she was about to say something she had already rehearsed. "How does it feel?" she said, settling her eyes on me. "To watch me succeed while you do nothing." The table laughed. Not meanly. It was a family laugh. The laugh of people who understood they were watching a performance and were performing their own appreciation. Her brother looked at the table. Her father looked at her with the satisfaction of a man watching something he helped build. She leaned back, giving me room to react, and added, "Don't be mad. I'm just teasing." I looked at her. I set down my fork. "Teasing is fun," I said. "Want to hear mine?" She smiled. She thought I was finally playing along, finally loosening, finally finding the joke funny, finally becoming the person she needed at that table. Her smile was genuine. That was the thing about her. Even then, even in that moment, the warmth was real. She wasn't performing the warmth. I reached down and pulled the folder from my bag. I set it on the table between us and opened it to the first document. The shareholder registry, printed that morning, clean and current. I smoothed it flat with one hand and slid it toward the center of the table. Her father leaned forward. Old habit. He always moved toward documents. His eyes went to the top of the ownership column, to the first line, to the largest percentage. He went still. His name was not at the top. It was listed third, 14.8%. He looked at the name that was listed first. Then he looked at the percentage beside it. Then he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger, not contempt, but something I can only describe as the look of a man who has just understood that a room he thought he owned has always had another door. My wife's eyes moved from her father's face to the document. She found my name on the first line. She found the number beside it. Her face didn't crumple. She was too composed for that. What happened was subtler, something behind the eyes, like a picture that takes a moment to resolve into what it actually is, and then you cannot unsee it. I stood. I straightened my jacket, the same one I always wore. "I own 77% of the company," I said. "You're fired." Nobody moved. Not her brother, who had gone very still. Not her cousins, who were looking at each other and then at the table. Not the aunt at the far end, who had finally found a moment in which she had nothing to affirm. Not the server, who had appeared in the doorway with dessert menus and now stood there frozen, holding them against his chest. Her father made a sound, just once. That wasn't quite a word. She set down her glass. I picked up my bag, closed the folder, and walked out of the room. The hallway was quiet. The restaurant beyond it was full of people having normal evenings, none of whom were aware that anything had changed. I handed the valet my ticket. I stood outside in the November air and waited for my car. It was a good jacket. It had always been a good jacket.